In episode 112, titled Zero Trust Fundamentals, Identity as Perimeter and Continuous Verification, we frame zero trust as reducing implicit trust everywhere, because the core idea is not a new buzzword, but a shift away from assuming that being inside a network equals being safe. Hybrid networks, remote work, cloud services, and attacker lateral movement have all made location-based trust less reliable, so zero trust emphasizes proving trust repeatedly rather than granting it once and forgetting about it. The exam typically expects you to describe zero trust in practical terms, focusing on identity, device context, and explicit policy, rather than on any single vendor implementation. This episode is about the mindset and the mechanics, where you reduce broad-standing access and instead grant precise access to what is needed when it is needed with signals that support verification. When you approach it this way, zero trust becomes a set of design principles that can be applied incrementally rather than a disruptive rebuild. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to the CloudNetX books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Identity becomes the main gate in a zero-trust model because user and workload identity is a more precise control point than network location alone. Location-based controls can still be useful, but identity is the piece that can follow the user across networks, devices, and environments, enabling consistent policy when the user is on-premises, remote, or in the cloud. Identity also supports accountability because actions can be tied to specific users and roles, and those ties enable auditing, incident response, and meaningful least privilege enforcement. The exam often frames this as identity being the new perimeter, meaning the gate you protect most carefully is the authentication and authorization decision rather than the physical boundary of a network. When identity is central, you can apply policies like multi-factor authentication, conditional access, and role-based authorization consistently, even when the network path changes. This is why zero trust is not anti-network, but it is anti-assumption, where network location stops being a blanket trust signal. Continuous verification is the principle that trust should be evaluated repeatedly using device posture and behavior signals because credentials alone do not guarantee legitimacy once an attacker has stolen them. Device posture refers to whether a device meets security requirements, such as being patched, having required agents, and being managed, because unmanaged or unhealthy devices increase compromise risk. Behavior signals include anomalies like impossible travel, unusual access patterns, and atypical request volumes, because attackers often behave differently than legitimate users even when they have valid credentials. Continuous verification does not mean prompting users constantly, but rather using risk signals to adapt the level of assurance required, adding friction when risk increases and reducing friction when confidence is high. The exam expects you to connect this to conditional access thinking, where access decisions incorporate context rather than relying on static credentials. When verification is continuous, access becomes resilient because it can respond to changing conditions instead of assuming every authenticated session remains trustworthy forever. Least privilege and explicit access per resource are fundamental because zero trust reduces the blast radius of compromise by ensuring that access is only granted to what is needed, not to entire networks by default. Least privilege means users and workloads receive the minimum permissions necessary to perform their tasks, and those permissions are scoped to specific resources, actions, and time windows where possible. Explicit access means you define who can access what, under what conditions, rather than relying on the fact that a device can route to a subnet as proof of authorization. This matters because broad access creates broad lateral movement opportunities, and attackers exploit those opportunities after initial compromise. The exam tends to test your ability to translate business needs into precise access rules, such as allowing access to one application rather than granting a full virtual private network that exposes many internal networks. When you think in explicit resource access, you naturally design policies that are enforceable and auditable. Segmentation remains an important supporting control because even with identity-centric policy, identity can fail through credential theft, misconfiguration, or insider misuse, and segmentation limits how far that failure can spread. Segmentation creates boundaries between user networks, application tiers, management planes, and sensitive data stores, forcing traffic to cross controlled points where additional policy and monitoring can be applied. In zero-trust thinking, segmentation is not the primary proof of legitimacy, but it is the containment layer that assumes some compromise will happen and reduces the chance that it turns into a full environment breach. Segmentation also supports operational stability because it narrows dependencies and clarifies traffic paths, making it easier to detect abnormal movement and to isolate affected zones during incidents. The exam often expects you to see segmentation as complementary, where identity gates decide access and segmentation gates limit movement, especially for high-value assets. When segmentation is aligned to critical flows, it reinforces zero trust by making implicit trust paths harder to exploit. A scenario that illustrates the model is granting a user access to one application rather than granting full network access, which is a common exam pattern because it reveals the difference between resource access and network location trust. In a traditional model, a remote user connects through a virtual private network, spelled out as virtual private network on first mention, and once connected, they may have broad reachability to internal segments even if they only need one application. In a zero-trust model, the user authenticates strongly and is authorized explicitly for the specific application, often through an application access proxy or a service gateway that enforces policy at the application layer. The user can reach the app, but they cannot freely scan or connect to other internal systems, reducing lateral movement opportunity if the user device is compromised. Continuous verification can still apply, such as requiring stronger assurance if the device posture is poor or if behavior signals look suspicious. This scenario demonstrates the practical outcome the exam is looking for: access aligned to the resource, not to the network. Treating zero trust as a single product purchase is a pitfall, because zero trust is a model and a set of principles, not a boxed solution that replaces architecture and policy decisions. Vendors sell components that support zero trust, such as identity platforms, endpoint posture tools, access proxies, and policy engines, but the model only works when those components are integrated into a coherent policy system. Buying a product without defining access policies, inventorying resources, and establishing monitoring and governance usually results in partial deployment that does not change the real trust assumptions. The exam often tests this by asking which statement best describes zero trust, and the correct framing is usually about continuous verification and least privilege, not about a named appliance. The practical reality is that zero trust is achieved through many changes, including identity hardening, access policy definition, segmentation refinement, and monitoring maturity. When you view zero trust as a program rather than a purchase, you avoid the disappointment and drift that come from treating it as a one-time procurement. Ignoring logging and monitoring is another pitfall because continuous verification depends on signals, and without signals, you cannot evaluate risk or detect misuse effectively. Verification requires telemetry from authentication systems, endpoints, network flows, and application access logs, because behavior anomalies and policy enforcement outcomes must be observable. Without logging, you cannot tell whether a user's access pattern is normal, whether a device posture changed, or whether an access decision was made for the right reason, and that makes it impossible to tune policies responsibly. Monitoring also supports response because when a compromise occurs, you need to know which resources were accessed, which identities were used, and whether lateral movement was attempted. The exam expects you to connect zero trust to monitoring because never trust, always verify implies verification has evidence, and evidence comes from logs and signals. When logging is strong, verification can be adaptive and precise rather than static and blind. Quick wins for zero trust often start with inventorying resources and defining access policies clearly, because you cannot enforce explicit access if you do not know what exists and what should be reachable. Inventorying resources means identifying applications, data stores, administrative interfaces, and services, and understanding which ones are critical and which ones are exposed to which user populations. Defining access policies means specifying which roles can access which resources, under what conditions, and through what access paths, because those policies become the blueprint for enforcement and for monitoring. These quick wins also reduce confusion because they replace vague statements like employees need access with specific statements like finance users need access to this application from managed devices with strong authentication. The exam tends to reward this clarity because it shows you understand explicit access as the foundation of zero trust. When inventory and policy definition are done, technical enforcement becomes a matter of implementing known intent rather than inventing rules during incidents. Operationally, reviewing access regularly and removing stale privileges is critical because zero trust is weakened by standing access that accumulates over time. Privileges drift when people change roles, projects end, and emergency access grants remain in place, and drift creates implicit trust that violates the core model. Regular review identifies who still needs access, whether the access scope is still correct, and whether exceptions and break glass permissions are still justified. Removing stale privileges reduces both attack surface and insider risk, because fewer accounts have broad access and fewer old permissions remain available to be abused. The exam often expects you to recognize that least privilege is not a one-time configuration, but an ongoing discipline that requires review and governance. When access is reviewed routinely, zero trust policies stay aligned with current business needs instead of becoming a historical snapshot. A memory anchor that fits this episode is verify identity, verify device, verify behavior, limit access, because it captures the continuous verification and least privilege loop in a way that is easy to recall. Verify identity covers strong authentication and role-based authorization, ensuring the user or workload is who it claims to be. Verify device covers posture and management signals, ensuring the endpoint meets the security bar required for the requested access. Verify behavior covers anomaly detection and risk signals, ensuring the access pattern makes sense for that identity and device. Limit access is the policy outcome, where access is granted only to the specific resource and action needed, not to broad networks by default. This anchor aligns well with exam language because it is both conceptual and actionable, and it helps structure answers to scenario questions that ask how to implement zero trust principles. A useful exercise is rewriting a broad access request into a precise policy, because this is exactly the kind of thinking the exam is testing when it presents vague business needs. If someone requests access to the internal network, a zero-trust rewrite would specify the exact application or data set needed, the role that requires it, the allowed access path, and the required assurance signals, such as managed device posture and multi-factor authentication. It would also specify conditions, such as requiring access only during business hours or only from known regions unless a trusted remote access path is used, depending on risk tolerance. The rewrite would include explicit denial of unrelated resources, ensuring that reachability does not imply authorization, and it would define logging requirements so access can be monitored and reviewed. This exercise builds the ability to move from vague trust to explicit policy, which is the heart of the zero-trust model. Practicing this rewrite improves both exam performance and real-world policy design. As a recap prompt, zero trust can be defined in one sentence as a security model that assumes no implicit trust and requires explicit, continuously evaluated verification of identity and context for each access request, granting only the minimum access needed. That sentence matters because it captures the essence: explicit access, continuous verification, and least privilege, without relying on vague claims about products or perimeter elimination. The exam often rewards concise definitions like this because they show you understand the model rather than the marketing. It also reinforces that zero trust is about decision-making at the point of access, using evidence and policy. When you can state it clearly, you can apply it to scenarios more easily. A good definition becomes a mental compass for designing controls and answering exam questions. Episode 112 concludes with the idea that zero trust is a set of principles that reduce implicit trust by making identity the main gate and by continuously verifying device posture and behavior signals before granting precise, least privilege access to each resource. Segmentation remains a valuable containment layer when identity fails, and strong logging and monitoring are required because verification depends on observable signals. Avoiding pitfalls means not treating zero trust as a single purchase and not ignoring the telemetry and governance needed to keep policies effective over time. The policy rewrite rehearsal assignment is to take one broad access request, rewrite it into an explicit resource-level policy with identity, device, and behavior conditions, and then narrate how that policy would be enforced and reviewed. When you can narrate that rewrite clearly, you demonstrate exam-ready understanding of zero trust as an operational model rather than a slogan. With that mindset, zero trust becomes a practical roadmap for reducing blast radius and improving decision quality in hybrid networks. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.